The member for Denison.
Good evening, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, this bill is bad public policy, and I'm very disappointed, and I'm sure I speak for a great many people in the electorate of Denison and throughout Tasmania when I say this is bad policy and it should not be pursued, and it's very disappointing the government is so determined to ram or to try and ram these sorts of reforms through the parliament. Why on earth would we be asking university students to pay more, asking university students to start paying back their debt sooner? Why on earth would we be cutting university funding even more when they're already chronically underfunded, even though we live in one of the richest and most clever and most fortunate countries in the world, the country more than any other country that can afford to properly resource our universities. But yet here we are, again back in this place, debating again more cuts to university funding. This is going to hurt the University of Tasmania greatly, and I associate myself with the comments from the member of Braddon, who's covered some of this ground quite effectively. By one estimate, the University of Tasmania will see its funding cut by over $11 million annually by 2021 if these so-called reforms come to pass. And in a small state with a relatively small university that is cross-subsidising two campuses outside of Hobart, and in fact is cross-subsidising the campus at Burnie to a very great extent, this is one university that simply cannot afford to lose $11.2 million annually. And it's not just the university that will be worse off, it will be the students that will be worse off. In fact, students will be paying something like $11.3 million extra in fees in Tasmania by 2021 if these so-called reforms go through. This will hurt the University of Tasmania. This will hurt students at the University of Tasmania. This will especially hurt the campus and the students at the smaller campus of Burnie, and I associate myself in full with the very wise comments from the member for Braddon about the Burnie campus. It's also a direct attack on disadvantaged people and women throughout Tasmania and throughout this country. Because when you are asking, or demanding I should say, ex-students on incomes as low as $42,000 a year, barely above the minimum wage, to start paying back their debts, then that is unacceptable, and it will disproportionately hurt disadvantaged people, people on low incomes, people who are, for good reason, in and out of the workforce and have a lower average income. For example, women who might be in and out of the workforce as they start a family, raise a family. Perhaps men, I would hope men as well, who are in and out of the workforce, for them to care for the young children, to allow their partner in the workforce full-time. This is ill-considered policy, Deputy Speaker, very ill-considered policy. And this is policy that is coming on top of all of the other cuts to the tertiary sector over recent years. For example, between 2010 and 2013, the Gillard Labor government cut $2.3 billion from universities. Cuts that have been so severe that effectively now our universities throughout the country are underfunded by about $1 billion a year. And I make the point again, Deputy Speaker, in one of the richest countries in the world, a country with a federal budget this financial year, forecast expenditure of some $456,000 million. But with all that money sloshing around, with all that we know about the value of education and the richness it brings both to our community and to the members of our community, the government would go ahead with a reform that's going to cost the University of Tasmania alone over $11 million a year from 2021 and hurt campuses like the Burnie campus. A reform that's going to cost the students at our university over $11 million a year by 2021. This is not good enough, Deputy Speaker. And don't just count my word for it. If you don't believe me, Deputy Speaker, then let's believe the OECD. because they have just released a report, the Education at a Glance Report 2017. And they have put Australian public investment in tertiary education institutions now at 0.7 of 1% of our GDP, some 40% below the OECD average of 1.1% of GDP. You know where that puts us, Deputy Speaker? 30th out of 34 countries when it comes to public funding for our universities. How naive and short-sighted are we when all that we know about the value of education? How are we going to compete with the 29 countries ahead of us in the OECD when we're dumbing down our education and we're restricting education to the rich or the kids of the rich or the kids in the big cities? How are we going to compete with the other 29 countries, Deputy Speaker? Well, we won't. It's as simple as that. One of the problems here is this obsession over many years, and I'll probably trace it back to the Howard government, this obsession which has continued to this day with commercialisation and privatisation and user pays. We've now got a two-class society in this country, and it's going to get a whole lot worse if this bill goes through. A two-class society, the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the disadvantaged, the people who can afford user pays and the people that can't afford user pays. A two-class society, the rich and the poor. And the rich, they're doing okay. They'll go to the best private schools. They'll go to the best universities. They'll go to the best hospitals. And they'll do well and they'll keep doing well. And it will snowball and they'll do better and better and better, and their families will do better and better and better. And what about the rest of the community? The people who can't afford user pays, who are going to have to put up with underfunded universities, low-priced courses, underfunded hospitals, underfunded high schools, underfunded primary schools. Safety nets was what John Howard referred to the public education system. A safety net, a bizarre comment, but a comment which is being echoed by the current Conservative government. This obsession with privatisation and commercialisation, where don't worry about the members of the community, just make them pay more for their course and make them start paying it back sooner. A reliance on foreign students, a reliance on commercial sponsorship of research, all about user pays and someone else paying for it other than the government. You know, I saw in the paper this morning, Deputy Speaker, a report that the accumulated student debt in this country has now reached approximately $50 billion. But the tone of the article in the paper, Deputy Speaker, was that this is a problem, it's too much money and the government has to claw it back. But you know what? The government's missing the point, Deputy Speaker, because that's $50 billion that the government should have paid for. It shouldn't be $50 billion of student debt that we're now going after, because the governments over many years have shifted $50 billion of the government's financial responsibility to students themselves. And much of that outstanding debt is being carried by lower-income people, lower-income families, disadvantaged people. They're carrying that debt, but the government's still going after them. That's not good enough. That's cost-shifting. So how dare the government be telling the media today, seemingly as though it's an explanation for this bill. You know, the government saying, all of these people owe all this money and that's bad and we want it back. Well, the government should never have had them rack up the bill in the first place. In fact, Deputy Speaker, I'll go so far as to say that the last good university policy we had in this country was between 1972 and 1975, when there was fee-free undergraduate study for Australian students. That's where we should be going. That's where we should be trending, not trending to more and more user pays and complaining because students are racking up debt and they're not paying it back quick enough. We are rich enough to return to the days of the early 70s. We are rich enough to do what Gough Whitlam did and to say we can not tolerate education, we can celebrate education. We understand the inherent value of education. We understand that the more learned our community is, then the happier they are, the more prosperous they are, the healthier they are, the better this country can compete with the 29 countries in the OECD who fund their universities better than us. How on earth do we compete with countries like Singapore and Thailand and China and Korea and Taiwan, countries that celebrate learning and invest so much more money into the community? No wonder they're doing so well. No wonder we're struggling against these countries when it comes to trade and other matters. We're just missing the point here. We're completely and utterly missing the point. $456,000 million forecast expenditure in Australia in this financial year. But you know what? We've still got to go after uni students. We've still got to cut funding for universities. We've still got to complain that university students owe too much. We are missing the point, Deputy Speaker. I'd make that point again. In fact, I'm going to labour this point because I don't think it's ventilated enough in this place, Deputy Speaker. We can actually afford, and I think we should aspire to, and maybe a future government will come along with the foresight and the fortitude to return us to the early 70s when we saw the value in free or fee-free undergraduate university places. That's what we need to do. That's exactly what we need to do, Deputy Speaker. That's where we should be heading. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing that, or at least trending towards it, because we can afford it. We can definitely afford it. It's all about priorities. Everything in this place comes back to priorities. Now, I know money can't solve all problems, but I tell you what, it can go a long way to solving many problems. And with the amount of money that's sloshing around in this place, you've really got to wonder why we have so many problems, why we have underfunded universities to the tune of $1 billion a year, underfunded hospitals with ridiculous waiting lists, underfunded high schools, underfunded primary schools, homeless living on the street, people who can't afford their power bills in a country as rich as ours. It's because too few people in this place, Deputy Speaker, have the vision to fix it, or have the priorities in the right order to fix it. You know, the government thinks it's okay. In fact, the government's boasting of trending towards 2% spending on defence. That they're going to double the submarine fleet, even though we can't find the crews for the existing 6. But don't worry about that. Don't worry that we can't find the crews for our 6 subs. Let's buy 12. I mean, how ridiculous. All this chest beating. Why don't we get our priorities in order? Yes, we need a defence force. Yes, we need to replace the submarines. But let's get our priorities in order. This outrageous amount of money we're spending on the Joint Strike Fighter when there were always other cheaper alternatives. Why aren't we raising more revenue? Why don't we have a super profits tax on any sector of the economy that achieves a disproportionate return on its investment? Why don't we get a bit more tax back from the banks that made $30 billion profit last year? They can afford to pay a bit more. High-wage earners like ourselves, parliamentarians, we can afford to pay a bit more. There are so many ways that we can save money in the budget sensibly, so many ways that we can raise extra revenue in this country sensibly. So many things we could be doing and talking about in this place, but what are we talking about tonight? We're talking about attacking the tertiary sector, which is already underfunded by $1 billion a year, and we're debating whether or not we should go after it for more. And I bring my little talk back to Tasmania, Deputy Speaker. Tasmania, a small state, a small uni, a lot of disadvantaged people. But yet this government thinks it's okay, to cut the University of Tasmania's funding by over $11 million a year. This government thinks it's okay to charge Tasmanian students at the University of Tasmania more than $11 million extra in fees each year. And in doing so, jeopardise some of the most disadvantaged people in the state and in this country, and very important campuses like Burnie. I don't support this bill. I'm pleased the opposition won't support this bill. It's bad public policy, Deputy Speaker.